This podcast is sponsored by Teens and Youth in Leadership, TYIL Africa, an organization that is committed to raising generations of young leaders across Africa. Our programs include leadership education, leadership fellowship, research training, webinars, and conferences. Stay informed of our programs by following us on LinkedIn at TYIL and at TYIL Africa on Instagram.
Hello, my name is Israel Idari. I'm a social scientist and a pragmatist. As a social scientist, my research is focused on understanding how youth develop leadership to make social change within their communities and immediate environment. I'd like to invite you to this podcast where I interview and have conversations with scholars and practitioners on their perspective on leadership, followership, and social change. I hope you truly learn from this podcast. Have fun. It's good to have Dan here. Dan is a professor of leadership and organizational studies, and his research focuses on leadership education, followership, critical thinking, political leadership, and artificial intelligence. So, Daniel, it's so nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I would like to start off our conversation by asking your sincere thoughts on the state of followership or followership education across the United States colleges. So do you think there's been any development over the last couple of years in followership education?
Yeah, I think there has, and it's a great question. But I think it's been slow going. While leadership programs have certainly exploded over the last 10 to 15 years, that's been a big focus of the research that I've done. We've got hundreds of majors and minors and certificate programs across the U.S. The same is definitely not true for followership education. Sometimes there's individual courses, it's rarely taught as a standalone subject. Barbara Kellerman, who's at the Harvard Business School, she made a funny joke at a International Leadership Association conference. Gosh, this was maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And, she said, I tried to offer this course on followership, and none of the business students would take it. But when I called it the leadership system, leaders, followers, and context, she's like, a bunch of people signed up for it. And then I just taught the followership class that I meant to teach in the first place, so it's been kind of funny in that way, and I learned recently that our institution, University of Southern Maine, we were actually one of the first universities, turns out, in the world to offer a course in followership. There was a time, this is maybe 2014 or 15, we got contacted by academic advising and said, hey, we've got a lot of students that are just looking for like 1 credit, or they need like 2 credits to finish their degree or their minor. And so we had this idea to offer these 1 credit deep dives into a particular leadership theory. We had 9 of them. Authentic leadership, complexity leadership. One of them was followership. They went well for a few years, and then our dean contacted us at some point and said, hey, we're trying to clean up some of these electives, and it doesn't seem like there's a ton of enrollment in these. And there weren't, maybe 5 or 6 students would take each one, in a given semester. So it was serving a particular purpose, but it wasn't like people were knocking down the doors for them. But, it was interesting that we were teaching a course dedicated to followership. It was a 5-week course, just to kind of, check that box. The last thing I'd say, about the state of followership education is Indiana Wesleyan University has definitely been a trailblazer. The folks over there campaigned to and effectively changed the name of their unit from the Division of Leadership Studies to the Division of Leadership and Followership Studies. And so folks have been kind of keeping an eye on what's going on over there in a good way, because they really have a good thing going, and they're very, very active in the space as well. So it's great to to see. Usually it's professors Mike Linville and Mark Renneker. They're very active in like the global followership conferences, as well as the International Leadership Association, and also see them in other conferences now and again. But that's kind of where I would say we're at from what I've been seeing. as far as what types of coursework has been offered. I've yet to see a degree program, like a minor in followership or a major or a master's in followership.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan, for sharing that. And I really must say that you're one person that I know that's consistently pushed out, research work on followership education. And I'm going to talk a little bit about your research shortly, but I want to know what you think about students' receptiveness in this followership education. So when you put out a course like this, what's the attendance level?
Yeah, I mean, like I kind of alluded to, we might have had, 6 to 10 students that signed up, and those were quick hit classes. It's much more frequently integrated as other topics in, say, a leadership theory course. I teach in a given year, in fact, yeah, in the last academic year, I taught all three: our intro to leadership at our undergraduate level. We also have a leadership theory course at the undergrad level that's at a higher, the first one was a 200 level, this is the 300 level. And then I also teach a cross-listed course for our master's and PhD students, which is our theory seminar. And I'll spend at least 1 or 2 weeks on followership because I have some expertise in the area. And also, it's a really, really important topic to focus on because leadership's just half the story. I will say, though, sometimes you get deer in headlights looks from the students when you bring up the word followership. The same isn't true with leadership. If you ask a group of 50 people anywhere, have you heard of leadership? All the hands are going to go up. Have you heard of followership? Not so much, but I will say that in academic spaces, I've seen that number go up. More and more students, particularly those that are taking our leadership classes, have been exposed to it, or maybe they've come across, exposed to it maybe in another class, or they've, it somehow made its way across their feed or what have you. But a lot of times we have to do, like a bait and switch type of activity or something, we'll share characteristics of a good follower, put them on the board and say, well, what is this? They'll say, oh, this is, characteristics of a good leader. And in fact, it came from an article on followership or, an empirical study that was, asking people about what are the characteristics of a good team member or a good follower. And so I've seen that as a useful tool. I think the last thing I'll share about that is an activity that Mark Hurwitz, who's over at University of Waterloo in Canada and one of the co-authors of that book I just mentioned, Leadership is Half the Story. He likes to do a short activity where he'll, and I've done this in my classes. It starts with, hey, how many of you report to at least one person in your organization? And, most of the time, maybe all but 1 or 2 hands go up in the room. And then I'll say, okay, great. Well, how many of you are the top person in your organization and nobody reports to you? And maybe 1 or 2 hands go up, right? Maybe you have a business owner or a CEO or something. And we say, well, then what's all this work about leadership development that we're doing, right? What about the followers? There's more of you in here than there are leaders. And so sometimes it takes some activities like that.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I really must congratulate you on your recent award as the Peter Nothouse Distinguished Teaching Award by the ALE. Congratulations.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. That was quite an honor and unexpected.
You deserve it, I believe.
Well, thank you.
All right. Do you want to share a little bit about the research on rolling within the process, effects of followership education on team member performance?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was kind of a fun way that we fell into, into that particular research where we were both engaged in coaching the collegiate leadership competition. Folks can check that out at collegiateleader.org or at the Management and Organizational Behavior Teaching Society's site. That's M as in management, obts.org. Great association. They took over that project about 2 years ago at this point, but it's something that's been going on since about 2015 and 16. But like Lori, I was coaching a student team or two, and we were on a coach's call doing some professional development. And we learned that we were both using followership texts for our leadership competition class. And we found that was kind of interesting. I knew Lori, but not super well. We had interacted, a few times at conferences and things, and I knew some of her colleagues. But I said, there's something to this because both of our teams were fairly successful in the competitions. They tended to perform really, really well. And I said, well, which book do you use? And I'm not being paid by the Hurwitzes, but she said, hey, we use Leadership is Half the Story as our primary text. And I said, oh, I use Ira Shaleph's Courageous Follower as one of my primary texts. And we were asking each other, well, why? Why is this important? Why followership in a Teams class? Why not use Five Dysfunctions of a Team or a Group Dynamics textbook or something like that? And, I said, for me, I said, I want them to be really good team members. And in addition, the Courageous Follower text is just like the world's best desktop manual for having tough conversations and giving critical feedback to a team member. It's loaded with examples and templates and scenarios of tough conversations that you might have when you're speaking to the hierarchy. And that was a really important skill that I wanted my students in that class to have. And so that became a really, really important component of that. One of the other things that we found as a key finding from that research that we did, where we interviewed students from each of our teams that had participated in a given competition year of the CLC, one of the most, what would I say, impactful activities that was less intentional than perhaps we first thought was the way that we practice for the competition. Is there's scores of practice activities that we'll have the students work through in teams. But one of the interesting things is at the competition, you generally have a team of 6 students, and one student gets to be the leader for each of the 6 activities. When you're not the leader, you're in a non-leader role. So during practices, we do the same thing and we just rotate. But what that in turn does is it gives an opportunity for the students to take on not just that leader role, but to also practice what it means to be in that team role or non-leader role. And so when they rotate and end up back in the other role, they are like, oh, you know what? I've been here before. I should have spoke up more, or maybe I need to speak up less, or I know what I would have needed in this particular role, right? And some standing teams, you're in the same role for the duration of the class or the duration of the team, and so you're not afforded that opportunity to to rotate and kind of mix up your role. And so that's where this idea of what we call rolling, spelled ROLE dash ING, is that ability to kind of discern between the different roles, and to do that with with critical thought and with some discernment.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. It was really fascinating for me because I cited your work. It was fascinating
Thank
to
you.
welcome. It was fascinating to identify that, at the end of the whole activity, the understanding of the participants about leader and follower relationship and dynamics changed significantly. So it shows that, by engaging the college students in these rolling activities, we could actually change their behavior and perception. So now, how about parents, community members who would like to develop the followership behavior or develop the followership skill of their youth? How do you think we can integrate followership education beyond the curricular level and into the family, societal context?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely an underexplored area. When I think about, youth or college, leadership programs outside of the academic space, we're talking about athletics and service learning, student organizations, residence life. I think those are all labs for followership, but I think we really need to, in order to do that, and I've, anytime I've had opportunities to work with those groups on my campus or other campuses, there seems to be a very, very strong interest in followership. And it always begins, in my experience, encouraging these students and these youth to reflect on the different roles they have within the teams and organizations that they're on. I'll ask them who supports who challenges who holds space for others. And so I think those are really important things to think about. I also will do an activity. In fact, I'm going to do it in my class tonight, my graduate class, where I ask students to think about a time where they either gave feedback or a time where they receive feedback. And they'll write that down, maybe they journal for a minute or two, and I'll have them, share with a partner what that exchange looked like. And then I'll have them share and talk about, let them decide, were you in a leader or follower role? Oftentimes it's assumed that if you were the one receiving feedback, you were in a follower role. But let's say you were giving feedback to your boss. right? Or somebody in a role, somewhat above you in your hierarchical space, or maybe it was the coach on your athletic team, right? If you're in a youth type of context, and then I use that as a springboard for saying, look, those performative experiences, right? What did you learn from that experience? And whether you were in a leader or a follower role, however you define it, these are great opportunities to learn more about how you show up as a leader or a follower, or in any event as a team member. And so really, really pushing and challenging learners that you don't have to be the president or the team captain to have an experience that you can learn from, in a leadership space. When I think about, you mentioned, families and communities, maybe religious spaces, I think people follow by, it's kind of the same thing. It's like by supporting, by dissenting, by holding leaders accountable, and thinking about what is the mission of this organization, what's ethical, why am I a part of this team or this group, or what have you, and kind of using that as that lens for taking on that role as a follower, or what some might argue if you're adopting the Shale model as a courageous follower.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. That's interesting to know. So, how have you balanced being a leadership educator and being a followership educator? That's a very tricky question, right?
That's a good question. Are they two sides of the same coin? I mean, I think it helps me to always be mindful that I'm not speaking to the top of the organization.
Mm,
I think that's been important to me since and it's probably, not even probably, it's a big part of why I got into the work in the first place. Is I was introduced to some really inclusive and collaborative processes for bringing people together when I was an undergraduate at the Florida State University, in student government. And, I had come from, high school where I was somewhat involved in student government, but not a lot, because it really was just a popularity contest at that level, right? At the college level, when you've got 30,000 students and, $10 million budget, at least it was at that time, I'm sure it's more now, you need a much different type of leadership. And, the way that our groups would work was, we've got to develop these platforms together. We've got to we're never going to get elected if we're not listening to students and working on issues that are important to, the populace, right? And so, which is much more a microcosm or a simulation of real politics, because I've also worked in those spaces as well. Much, much different than, middle school, high school student council. And so I think, how do I balance that role, to go back to your original question, is really always being hyper focused and mindful on, let's make sure we're talking about the other members of the team, the other roles, supporting those roles, but also challenging and supporting the leader as necessary, right? Based on, is this the right thing to do? What's popular isn't always right. What's right isn't always popular.
mm, yeah, thank you. So, let's go to artificial intelligence. How do you think artificial intelligence can promote followership education? Or basically, how do you think artificial intelligence has disrupted has disrupted things?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm been experimenting quite a bit over the last 3 years. I was definitely an early adopter with artificial intelligence, because I've always been a tinkerer with technology. And when I understood how these large language models work, your Chat GPTs, your Claudes, your Geminis, I thought, well, if it understands language, then it can probably build curriculum, and it can probably build learning activities. It can probably build case studies, and it does all those things. It does some of those things really well. If you have the right prompt, it hallucinates and sometimes misses out on some things, but I've absolutely found opportunities to create simulations, scenario-based role plays, reflective prompts, journaling tools, role modeling, providing examples of, what a courageous follower might look like, when to speak up, when to support, when to dissent. But there's inherent risks and misuses. If you over rely on AI generated content, it can certainly short circuit something like a personal reflection, right? If you're enabling or delegating, or what they refer to as cognitively, cognitive offloading your reflection to, a chatbot, then you're not doing the work. You're not doing the sense making. You're not finishing your experiential learning loop. And still, AI can have bias. it only is as good as the models that it's trained on. And so, that's a big part of it. I think oftentimes too, like, there's that reciprocal nature of the student and the faculty member, whether I say those are often leader follower roles, but they switch, right? A lot of leadership courses, particularly the ones I teach, they're discussion based. I want to hear about the experiences that students in my class have had. I want them to share. I want them to lead or facilitate components of my classes. And so in that scenario, I change my role, right? They're then at the front. But going back to the AI question, the sky's the limit within reason. But I think that for building activities and case studies and things like that, it's really, really helpful. I think the other way that it continues to evolve is as a tool to run scenarios by, to kind of, in air quotes, coach you. Hey, I'm having this issue on my team, or I'm trying to, I need to talk to my boss today, and here's my scenario. Can you give me, a script or a template to have that? Or hey, can we just role play this real quick, right? And so I think there's some opportunities for followership education with AI, and those are some of the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, thank you. So my final question: do you think educators should promote student use of artificial intelligence, and how can they uphold ethical standards while doing that?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. I do a lot of faculty development around AI, and it's one of the toughest challenges that we have, because a student can very easily, like I mentioned with the reflection, they can copy the prompt or the instructions that the professor has provided, drop it into ChatGPT, and 30 seconds later they've got a response. It makes up fake experiences. It hallucinate. Well, in that case, it's not even hallucinating. It's just making up. It's doing what you asked it to do. It just wants to play a role. And so I think you can utilize generative AI like a chatbot as a team member, as a collaborator. But when it starts to replace human thought instead of support it or improve it, then I think that's when it's being misused. And that's a pretty hard line for me, because I think there's only really three options you have as a faculty member, which is use it all you want. I'm talking about AI. Don't use it at all. Or if you use it, show me how you use it. I tend to be the show me how you use it type of professor. That's what my AI policy says, and I have a process for that. But in classes where you're writing about Shakespeare, or you've got mathematics, it's tough. I feel for my colleagues in those disciplines.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Dan. All right, so I'd like to ask if you have any final thoughts regarding the subject of followership, basically, and particularly in terms of youth.
I think at the end of the day, the future of leadership education, I think it really depends on how seriously we take followership. And I think we have to take it seriously and make sure it's part of our curriculum. We've spent decades telling students to be leaders, and as I mentioned with that activity that I borrowed from Mark Hurwitz, in most of life settings, people move in and out of leading and following constantly. They're more often in a follower role than they're in a leader role. If higher ed can help students to see followership as courageous, ethical, as essential, that we're preparing them not just for careers, but for citizenship, for community, for collaboration. And, there's tools like AI that might reshape how we learn and work, but that balance between leading and following is only going to become more important. So I think my vision is that, maybe in the next decade, followership education stands alongside leadership education and development and training as an equal partner. And we're giving students that full toolkit they need to thrive in, their teams, their organizations, and their communities.
Good. Thank you so much, Dan, for your time today. I really enjoyed learning from you, and I look forward to more opportunities learning from you.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to the Future of Leadership podcast today. If you are here to kindly share, subscribe, leave a review, and follow us across our social media platforms, including Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram, all at TYIL. See you in the next episode.